Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about what's probably the most significant and influential music festival in the US and probably in the world right now, and that's Coachella. We're in the middle of the two-weekend festival as it's become. And the reason that it's important beyond being a large cultural gathering that sort of brings in the summer season of music festivals, albeit in spring, but that just shows you how far ahead of the game they proverbially were. It's a very good barometer for what young and youngish people are engaging with, what makes them tick, what makes them click, both literally and figuratively, and what kinds of nostalgia are people going for, because nostalgia can be the latest thing. It's called a musical revival. And this brings me back to one of the concepts that I talk about a lot on this channel, and that's the influence of the technological media through which music is delivered and its relationship to the actual artistry of the music. Now, a music festival is in many ways the most ancient of all music delivery media. The live performance is literally where it all began. You can go to prehistorical days, and people with primitive instruments and with their voices and with other parts of their body were making music. And how was it delivered? It was delivered via live performance. So, live performance is one thing that's never gone out of fashion. The Edison cylinder isn't here anymore. The 8-track tape is gone. The LP record came, went, and sort of came back. But live performance is always going to be there. But of course, in the age of technology, and in particular since the age of the Industrial Revolution and later the Electrical Revolution, the technology has been incredibly influential on the delivery of the music. So let's focus on what's been going on since the very late 90s right up to the present day. And we'll begin with Napster, which was one of many things that changed everything. And certainly for the music industry, which was reeling in the dough in the 90s. Napster changed the economic model of music, as we all know. But how did it change the actual artistry of music? Well, in the 90s, rock and hip hop coexisted very comfortably. First with West Coast hip hop, and then with the revival of East Coast hip hop towards the end of the decade. It was really a genre that went from the periphery in the early 80s to capturing public attention in the late 80s to being a huge genre, both artistically and commercially in the 90s. But the 90s was also an era where so called alternative rock was absolutely huge as well. And it was selling big. And both of these genres coexisted, as I said, in both an artistic space and a commercial space. Napster comes along in 1999 and democratizes music more than just about any other medium in history. Not only is it free and easy to use, but just about everything that you'd want to hear was on Napster. There's some things that, mainly for legal and licensing reasons, aren't even on Spotify or Apple Music that were available on Napster. The problem was, of course, not an artistic or democratic one, but a legal problem. And every artist approached it in a different way. The cheerleaders against Napster from the music world were Metallica. They weren't the only ones, but they were the most vocal and they were the ones that got the most publicity. And while Dr. Dre was opposed to Napster, another great hip hop artist, Chuck D, a Public Enemy, was famously in favor of Napster, talking about its democratic values and its ability to challenge the corruption that had been very unfair to artists and creators in the music industry itself. Now, since Napster, we've seen hip hop and hip hop derived genres go way up in terms of their artistic profile, well, their proliferation, I should say, and in terms of their commercial viability. And the opposite has happened to rock and rock derived music. It's gone down and down and down since the 90s, since the late 90s, that is. And I think Napster had a lot to do with it because even though Napster was sued out of existence, there was no going back to the age where physical media that were becoming quite overpriced, adjusted for inflation in the 90s. There was no going back to that. And when Steve Jobs made the music industry an offer it couldn't refuse through legal online music, the die was cast. The system would now be legal, but the huge revenues of the 90s were not to come back. Now, what did all of this mean for music? Well, it meant that artists that were very good at commercializing beyond the recorded song, beyond the recorded album, did better than those who were primarily reliant on selling records. And thus we see hip hop survive and thrive in a post Napster, post iTunes world where rock did not. There are several reasons for this. Hip hop is really a genre based on strong personalities. Why? Because it's very lyrical, it's very poetic. The more street credibility, the more personal credibility it has, the more we're curious about the individuals behind it, who the artist is. In other words, there's very little anonymity in hip hop. People want to know the storytellers who are telling the stories, and great hip hop artists are all too happy to accommodate. They tell their audience about themselves. And because of this personal connection that hip hop artists are able to build with their audience, it became relatively simple to commercialize and merchandise other things, whether it be fashion, whether it be software or hardware, whether it be any sort of accoutrements, things that you're selling in terms of lifestyle. Hip hop artists did it. Just there's such a long list of hip hop artists that have sold things other than music itself. P. Diddy, who's in a bit of trouble now, but he was a pioneer in fashion. Kanye West, now known as Ye, huge, huge fashion icon. Dr. Dre with Beats by Dre became a billionaire because of the deals that he did with selling the most successful headphone brand in the world. 50 Cent, many business ventures. The list really could go on. Snoop Dogg is selling wine. Ice Cube, for a while, was selling weed, and in the places where it's legal now. And now he's part of the big three basketball leagues. So he's selling a sports based lifestyle and sports based entertainment. And this sort of left rock musicians behind, because most rock musicians were used to a format where they'd sell records that would help them to sell live tickets, and then they'd retreat into comparative anonymity. The very genre, the idea of the rock band versus the hip hop MC or the hip hop DJ, shows that it's one degree less personable than hip hop. And in an age where relying on music sales and later streams alone wasn't sufficient, we see hip hop very much overtake rock in the charts. And this is true of pop music derived from hip hop. This is somewhat ironic because one of the first musicians to really commodify his image was a rock star, Sammy Hagar. And before that, we go to a genre of country music, which is arguably even further removed from hip hop, and Jimmy Buffett, who was very successful at commercializing his image and his lifestyle. But Jimmy Buffett and Sammy Hagar were almost exceptions that prove the rule. Most of the people since then that have commodified their image and their lifestyle products beyond the music itself have been in hip hop. And this leads us to the next big innovation that happened after iTunes, and this was MySpace, which until TikTok, believe it or not, had been the most important social media platform where music was central to the user experience. Now, MySpace was launched in 2003, just a couple years after iTunes came out. And I'm not sure if you remember, but a central part of MySpace was having a profile song, a song essentially pinned to the profile that told your friends or those looking at your profile what you're about. And you could change the song. Some changed it every day, some changed it every month, some never changed it at all. And it was also one of the first platforms that made it easy to share music videos. YouTube, in many ways, owes its success to MySpace because the user interface on MySpace made it very easy to share YouTube videos, many of which were music videos. So while MySpace helped a struggling music industry to recover its relevance by reconnecting with the intimate and the personal, there's no clear evidence that it shaped the artistry of music beyond what Napster and iTunes were already doing in making hip hop go up in people's estimations and rock go down in people's estimations. Fast forward, and we've got TikTok. And it really is interesting that despite the advent of Facebook, of Twitter, and of Instagram in the intervening years between MySpace and TikTok, those platforms were never as successful at capturing the musical zeitgeist as MySpace was. And now TikTok has really overtaken what MySpace did and put music in a very central role of its existence as a company and as a platform. And the kind of stars that TikTok is creating are people with personal stories that are different than the artists that came pre TikTok. There really is a pre and post TikTok world. It's all about being authentic now. So it's not about being flash. It's not about being polished. It's about people self produced, doing their thing, and putting it out there on TikTok. So it's all about relatability. It's all about that authenticity. It's taking that hip hop ethos, but taking it to an even more amateur level. In other words, if hip hop was getting too polished and too produced, the TikTok era has, with a very different style of music, taken it back to the intimate roots of hip hop. And we see that at reflected at Coachella. Ice Spice is in many ways one of the most famous artists to get her start on TikTok. And she, of course, is one of many. We're living in the TikTok era where people are getting discovered, if you will, on TikTok. Now, I know that some of it is contrived. I know that some of the stuff that we are meant to think is authentic is really being produced by corporate power. That's going to be inevitable. But both some of the reality and all of the perception of the TikTok world is that it's intimate and authentic. So, getting back to music festivals, how does this affect music festivals? Well, there's an age old problem of how you translate intimate music into a large, large setting, whether it be an outdoor music festival like Coachella or a stadium, a football stadium, which are huge events. So let's look at how other genres have coped with this. Jazz copes more poorly with this phenomenon than anything else. And why? Because it's such an intimate musical format. Jazz works best when the audience can literally see the visual cues that help the musicians to sonically interact on the stage, which is why jazz is always best, not even in a small theater, but in a club. You want to really be on top of the jazz musicians. Another reason that intimate music like jazz tends to work better in small club like environments is because of the rhythmic intricacy. The great percussionist Bill Bruford talked about how the more intricate the rhythm is, the worse it works in large venues, because acoustically, the intricacy gets lost and it becomes noise, where in a small venue like a club, you can both hear it and see it straight up in your face. And so it works very well. Now, hip hop, while not necessarily as rhythmically intricate as jazz, is also an intimate format because one, there's not as many people on stage as in other formats. Two, it's primarily vocally driven, which means that you really need a direct connection with the audience. And three, when you look at its origins from the streets of New York to the backyards of LA and then to clubs throughout the world, it was really something where you wanted to connect with people. Now, jazz was never able to compensate for this handicap. Hip hop was. And the reason is because where jazz traditionally doesn't have a formal narrative to it, hip hop is incredibly narrative. And if it's got narrative, you can make it theatrical. And theatricality, by definition, means big. So the way that hip hop artists solved their intimacy problem, meaning the fact that it's hard to get intimate, musically speaking, in a giant outdoor field or a huge football stadium, they made it heavily theatrical. And now we've even got things like big listening parties in arenas and stadiums. You've got big interactive shows. You've got the lights. You've got the dancers. You've got everything. Just look, for instance, at Dr. Dre's Super Bowl halftime show from a few years ago. Huge production value, and it brought the intimate into the maximal. And so hip hop has overcome that. Rock, in many ways, since it's one of the necessarily loudest of all genres, actually works quite well in large venues because rock is always best when it can turn it up to 11. And then you've got theatrical rock bands like the Queens and the Pink Floyds of the world who were really good at turning their music into high theater. Bill Bruford would make the further point that bands like Pink Floyd, since most of the tempi in their music fairly moderato, on the slower side. It works better in huge environments than, let's say, a Mahavishnu orchestra type band where the rhythm is very intricate. So let's bring things up to today. TikTok is, of course, the music of TikTok tends to be in that intimate style. It tends to be something that people interact with on a computer screen or on their phone. So the question is, how are they going to make it translate to the festival circuit? Are festivals going to lean away from TikTok music as they did in the early days of hip hop because they didn't know how to strategically cope with it? And yes, there were social and racial factors in this, which are much less pleasant to talk about than the musical factors. But there was this musical factor as well of people genuinely not knowing how to take this intimate artistry and make it physically big. So we're going to really see in the next few years what this will be like. And the lineup of this year's Coachella is sort of where two worlds collide. You have No Doubt, which were a pre-Napster 90s band reuniting. You have people like Blur, also from that era. You have pre-TikTok, but very post-Napster artists like Tyler, the Creator. Doja Cat is relatively in that same category. But when you look at some of the other names of the list, they are from this TikTok generation. So it does seem that Coachella is embracing the TikTok generation and that the ease of theatricality made possible by vastly improved lighting and projection technology over the years is going to make this easier. But will this be able to sustain audiences the way that music designed for theatricality has over the years? Why do you think young people go to see Roger Waters, even though he's very old? Because the theatricality is built into it. Will the TikTok musicians of today be able to adapt their intimate style and intimate experiences of going from self-produced social media stars to the festival circuit? Will that be able to sustain itself once the novelty wears off? That's probably a question that some of the promoters of Coachella are thinking about. Otherwise, they may well have to keep defrosting your 80s and 90s stars, wheeling out the Rod Stewarts and the Bruce Springsteens. I'm joking, because they're obviously a bit more on the boomer side, where old by Coachella standards is now the Gen X bands, like No Doubt. So we'll see what the future holds. But once again, the medium is influencing the message. TikTok is doing it just as Napster kind of did it, just as the LP record very much did it, and the very invention of electronic recording very much did it long before that. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.